Now that the dust has settled, one bill legislating obscene materials in library books is going into effect January 1st. House Bill 1205 requires libraries to remove or relocate sexually explicit material and to have a policy in place for reviewing and removing library books. Carrie Betcher says they are reviewing current policy and procedure that they've had in place for more than a decade.
I started at the library, and that was over 10 years ago, and we've reviewed it since then, so we keep up to date to make sure it's still following what all we need to do.
She says they have had 2 books challenged in the last 5 years.